The cold of the linoleum floor seeped through the thin soles of Eleanor Vance's shoes, a damp chill that felt less like winter and more like a finality. It was the same cold she felt in her bones every morning, a reminder of the empty space in the bed beside her and the quiet that had long ago replaced the sound of her husband's breathing. In the sterile, fluorescent glare of the county clerk's office, that cold felt amplified, weaponized. Across the counter, a man named Marcus Thorne smiled, but the expression didn't touch his eyes. They were like polished river stones, smooth and empty of warmth. He slid a sheaf of papers toward her, his manicured finger tapping a bold, red-stamped heading. Final notice. "As you can see, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a low, condescending purr that carried easily across the hushed room. "Time's up. The bank's patience, and mine, has run out." Eleanor stared at the paper, the words blurring into an incomprehensible threat. She could feel the eyes of others on her, the young mother with a toddler in her arms, the tired-looking farmer in line behind her, the clerk pretending to be busy with her computer. They were all witnesses to her humiliation, their silence a heavy blanket of judgment. She was just another old woman who couldn't manage her affairs, a relic cluttering up the modern world. Her hands, gnarled with the arthritis that came from 60 years of gardening, kneading dough and holding her husband's hand, trembled as she reached for the papers. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery thing. "My husband Arthur. He made sure everything was settled." Thorne chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Arthur's been gone a long time, Eleanor. 10 years. A lot can happen in 10 years. Interest accumulates. Debts mature. The world moves on." He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss that was somehow more public than a shout. "Your husband's pension doesn't cover the new property taxes, let alone the reverse mortgage he took out during his illness. You're underwater. The house is worth less than what's owed. I'm doing you a favor, offering you a few thousand to walk away with your dignity." Dignity. The word was a slap. What dignity was there in being evicted from the home your husband built with his own 2 hands? The home where she'd raised 2 children, celebrated 50 anniversaries, and wept through the night he passed away? She clutched her worn cloth purse to her chest, the meager contents inside feeling as insignificant as she did. She straightened her back, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it cost her a universe of effort. "I will find a way," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of the iron it once possessed. Thorne's smile widened, a predator's glee. "With what? You have nothing. You are nothing. Just an old woman in an old house, waiting to be forgotten." He pushed the papers back toward her forcefully, and one sheet fluttered to the cold floor. He made no move to pick it up. He simply watched, waiting for her to bend, to break. Eleanor looked down at the paper, then back at his smug face. For a long, silent moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The farmer behind her shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the floor. The clerk's typing ceased. Eleanor did not bend. She left the paper where it lay, a white flag of defiance on a cold, indifferent floor, and turned to walk away. The silent judgment of the room followed her out into the biting November wind, a wind that promised a storm was coming. The wind howled around the corners of her small house, a mournful sound that seemed to mimic the ache in Eleanor's chest. Hours after the public shaming at the clerk's office, the feeling of cold had not left her. It had settled deep inside, a permanent winter. A sharp, aggressive knock at the door made her jump. She knew who it was before she even saw the long shadow of the luxury sedan parked at her curb. Marcus Thorne didn't believe in letting things rest. He stood on her porch, his expensive wool coat a dark slash against the gray afternoon, a stark contrast to the peeling paint on her railing. He held the paper she had left on the floor, waving it like a verdict. "We weren't finished," he said, pushing past her into the warmth of her small living room without invitation. The scent of his cologne, sharp and synthetic, felt like an invasion, a violation of the home's quiet history of baking bread and wood smoke. He surveyed the room with a look of undisguised contempt. The worn armchair where Arthur used to sit, the mantelpiece crowded with faded photographs of children and grandchildren, the hand-stitched quilt draped over the sofa. To him, it wasn't a home. It was an inventory of decay. "Look at this place," he scoffed, running a finger along a dusty bookshelf. "It's a fire trap, a relic. The land it's on is worth 10 times what this shack is." His eyes landed on a framed photo of a young Arthur in his military uniform, his smile proud and easy. Thorne picked it up. A hero, was he? They're all heroes until the bills come due. His pride is what got you into this mess. Eleanor. Too proud to ask for help. Too proud to sell when he had the chance. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You will not speak of my husband that way. Not in this house." Her voice was low, but it vibrated with a protective fury that surprised even herself. Thorne merely laughed, placing the photo back down with a careless clatter. "This won't be your house for much longer. I have the paperwork. The eviction is scheduled for the end of the week. I came here as a courtesy to repeat my offer. $5,000. Cash. You sign the deed over to me, and you can walk away. Otherwise, the sheriff will drag you out with nothing." He stepped closer, his physical presence crowding her, making her feel small and fragile. "Think about it, Eleanor. A cold winter is coming. You don't want to be on the street. Where would you even go? Your children are scattered, aren't they? Too busy with their own lives to care about their old mother." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to puncture her resolve and leave her bleeding despair. He was right. Her son was in Oregon, struggling with his own family. Her daughter was overseas, married to a man in the service. They had their own battles. This was hers to fight, and she had no weapons left. She looked past him, through the window, at the skeletal branches of the old oak tree Arthur had planted as a sapling. It had weathered countless storms. It had to. Its roots were deep. "This house is not for sale," she stated, the words tasting of ash and iron. Thorne's face hardened, the mask of civility dropping away to reveal the raw greed beneath. "Fine. Have it your way. But when you're freezing in some homeless shelter, remember this conversation. Remember that I tried to be reasonable." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the photographs on the mantel rattled, threatening to fall. Eleanor stood motionless in the sudden silence, the echo of his cruelty hanging in the air. The house seemed to sigh around her, its old timbers groaning under the weight of the threat. The conflict was no longer a matter of paperwork and legal notices. It was a war declared on her very existence, on the sanctuary of her memories. The scent of sawdust and old coffee still clung to the walls of the small workshop in the back of the house, a ghostly perfume of a life well lived. Eleanor ran her hand over the surface of Arthur's workbench, the wood worn smooth by decades of his patient labor. This was where he'd taught their son how to build a birdhouse, where he'd repaired her favorite rocking chair, where he'd retreated to think, to plan, to dream. Every gouge and stain in the wood was a sentence in the story of their life together. Her mind drifted back, not to the pain of his final years, but to the strength of his prime. Arthur Vance had been a man carved from oak, quiet and unshakable. He'd served 2 tours, coming home with a quietness that wasn't emptiness, but depth. He never spoke of the war, but he lived its lessons every day. You protect what's yours, you honor your word, and you never, ever let a bully win. He had built this house on a plot of land nobody wanted, on the edge of town, with his own hands. She remembered the sweat on his brow as he raised the first frame, the calluses on his palms, the look of fierce pride in his eyes when he'd carried her over the threshold. "This is it, Ellie," he had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is our fortress. No one can ever take this from us." He had meant it as a promise, a vow against the uncertainties of the world. For 50 years it had held true. They had weathered economic downturns, raised children who grew up and moved away, and faced down the creeping loneliness of old age, all within these 4 walls. When the cancer came, it was a siege they could not win. The reverse mortgage Thorne had mentioned so callously hadn't been a gamble. It had been a desperate act of love. It was Arthur's last stand, a way to pay for treatments that might buy him one more summer with her. One more chance to sit on the porch they'd built and watch the sunset. He'd hated the debt, she knew. It had wounded his pride to his core. "It's just paper art," she told him, holding his frail hand. "The real foundation is us," but now, that paper was a weapon in another man's hands, and Arthur was no longer here to defend their fortress. She walked back into the living room and picked up his military portrait. She traced the line of his jaw, the gentle strength in his eyes. He was a man of quiet dignity, a man who earned respect not by demanding it, but by living a life worthy of it. He was kind to stray animals, fair to his neighbors, and fiercely loyal to his friends. Among his few possessions was a worn leather vest from a motorcycle club he'd briefly belonged to after the war, a group of fellow veterans who found solace and brotherhood on the open road. He'd called them the last honorable men. He hadn't ridden in 30 years, but the vest still hung in the back of their closet, a relic of a younger, wilder time, a symbol of a code he never abandoned. Loyalty, honor, respect. These were the bricks with which he'd built his life, and they were the only inheritance she had left. As she stood there, clutching the frame, she felt a flicker of his strength pass into her. She was not just Eleanor Vance, a frail old woman. She was Arthur Vance's wife, and this was Arthur Vance's home. The thought did not offer a solution, but it solidified her resolve. Thorn could threaten and rage, but he could not touch the foundation of what this house truly was. A monument to a love that was stronger than greed, and a life lived with unwavering principle. The days leading up to the eviction deadline were a slow, grinding torment. Marcus Thorn was a man who enjoyed his power, and he wielded it with petty cruelty. The first sign was the phone line going dead. Eleanor discovered it when she tried to call the library about an overdue book, only to be met with an unnerving silence. A quick look outside revealed the wire had been snipped clean, a deliberate act of isolation. The next day, a large, crudely spray-painted sign appeared on her fence, the red letters dripping like blood. Foreclosure. Property of Thorn Development. Her neighbors saw it. Mrs. Gable from across the street pulled her curtains shut. Mr. Henderson, who had borrowed Arthur's tools for years, suddenly found the pavement intensely interesting when she was out getting her mail. Their fear was a palpable thing, a collective turning of backs. They were good people, she knew, but Thorn was a powerful man in their small town. He owned half the businesses on Main Street and had the town council in his pocket. To stand with her was to stand against him, and no one was willing to take that risk. The silence of her community was a different kind of wound, an ache of abandonment that settled alongside her grief. She was alone, a ghost in her own life, haunting the rooms of her past while the world outside pretended not to see her. The weather mirrored her despair. The sky turned a bruised, slate gray, and the wind carried the sharp, metallic scent of snow. The forecast spoke of a blizzard, the worst in a decade, set to hit the very night before the scheduled eviction. It felt like the heavens themselves were conspiring with Thorn, preparing to deliver the final, freezing blow. Eleanor spent her time methodically packing a small suitcase, a heartbreaking triage of a lifetime of memories. Arthur's photo, her wedding ring, which was now too loose for her finger, a bundle of her children's letters. Each item was a treasure, a shard of a life she was about to lose. She refused to let Thorn's men simply throw her history into a dumpster. She ate sparingly, stretching the last of the food in her pantry. A can of soup, some crackers, a little tea. The house grew colder as she conserved heating oil, wearing Arthur's old wool sweater for warmth. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on her shoulders. Thorn drove by several times a day in his sleek car, a silent, predatory circling. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to see her spirit crumble before he took the bricks and mortar. But as the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and heavy in the eerie twilight, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. She had endured the loss of her soulmate. She had endured the silence of her friends. She would endure this. She sat in Arthur's armchair, the small suitcase at her feet, and watched the snow begin to blanket the world in white. The house was quiet, a fortress of memory against the howling wind. She had nothing left to lose but her dignity, and she would hold on to that with the last of her strength. She would not beg. She would not cry. She would face the morning, and the sheriff, and the end of her world, as Arthur Vance's wife. The storm raged, and inside, Eleanor Vance waited, a solitary lighthouse in an ocean of white. The world outside had vanished, erased by a swirling vortex of wind and snow. The blizzard hit with a primal fury, rattling the window panes and piling drifts against the doors. The power had gone out an hour ago, plunging the house into a flickering, candlelit gloom. Eleanor sat wrapped in the hand-stitched quilt, the silence of the house broken only by the storm's relentless assault. It was in this moment of profound isolation that she heard it, a sound that did not belong. It was a sickening crunch of metal, followed by a low, scraping thud, just beyond her driveway. It was swallowed almost instantly by the wind, but she had heard it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Could be anything. Falling branch, a neighbor's trash can, but a sliver of instinct, a deeply ingrained sense of duty honed by a lifetime of caring for others, told her to look. Pulling on Arthur's heavy winter coat, she fought her way to the front door, the wind tearing at it as she forced it open. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. Through the blinding snow, she could just make out a dark shape half buried in the ditch at the edge of her property. It was a motorcycle, twisted and broken, and beside it, a figure was struggling to rise, only to collapse back into the snow. Fear warred with compassion. Thorne's threats echoed in her mind. The world had abandoned her. Why should she offer it any kindness? But then she saw the figure's leg, bent at an unnatural angle. She saw the way he shuddered, not just from the impact, but from the brutal, life-stealing cold. In that moment, he was not a stranger, not a threat. He was just a human being in desperate need. Arthur's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "You never leave a man behind." Her own troubles forgotten, Eleanor plunged into the storm. The snow was knee-deep, the wind a solid wall against her. Every step was a battle. When she finally reached him, she saw he was young, no older than her grandson. He was clad in heavy leather, but his face was pale, his lips turning blue. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were clouded with pain and disorientation. "Help?" he managed to stammer, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "My leg. Think it's broken." She put her arm around his shoulders, her small frame straining under his weight. "Come on, son. We have to get you inside." He was heavy, a dead weight of cold leather and pained muscle, but she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. Slowly, painstakingly, they fought their way back to the house, a small, desperate island of humanity against the storm's fury. Inside, she eased him onto the sofa, hissing in pain as his leg jostled. With practiced hands, she cut away the denim of his jeans. The break was obvious, the bone pushing grotesquely against the skin. She knew she couldn't set it, but she could stabilize it. She found 2 sturdy pieces of firewood and some torn-up bedsheets, fashioning a crude but effective splint. She coaxed him out of his frozen jacket and wrapped him in every blanket she owned. Then, she went to the kitchen and heated her last can of tomato soup on the small propane camp stove she kept for emergencies. She held the steaming mug to his lips, watching as the warmth slowly returned to his face. He drank gratefully, his eyes never leaving hers. They were filled with a mixture of pain, confusion, and a dawning, profound gratitude. He was a biker, covered in tattoos and wearing the emblem of a club that made most people cross the street. But Eleanor saw none of that. She saw a young man, hurt and freezing, who needed help. And in a world that had shown her nothing but coldness, she offered him the last of her warmth, without a moment's hesitation. The morning broke in a deafening silence. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. Sunlight, brilliant and sharp, streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor had spent the night in Arthur's armchair, dozing fitfully, keeping watch over the young man on her sofa. He had drifted in and out of a pained sleep, but his color had returned, and the shivering had stopped. As the sun rose higher, his eyes flickered open. They were clear now, a startlingly bright blue against his pale skin. He tried to sit up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his leg. "Easy now," Eleanor said softly, rising to check his makeshift splint. "You need to stay still." He looked around the room, taking in the faded photographs, the worn furniture, the quiet dignity of the space. His gaze fell upon her, and the look in his eyes was one of raw, unvarnished respect. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raspy. "I would have frozen out there. Anyone would have done the same," she replied, though she knew it wasn't true. "My name's Eleanor. I'm Cody," he said. "But my friends, they call me Patch." He gestured to a stitched-on patch on his leather jacket, which lay folded on a nearby chair. His eyes then caught the garish red letters of the foreclosure sign visible through the front window. A hard look, one that aged him years, settled on his face. "What's that?" he asked, his tone shifting from grateful to guarded. Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly. The reality of her situation, briefly held at bay by the night's emergency, came flooding back. "It's a long story," she said, her voice weary. "The short version is, this house won't be mine for much longer." She didn't need to explain the details. The predatory nature of the sign spoke for itself. Patch was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. He looked from the sign back to her face, then to the meager surroundings, the single can of soup she had shared with him, the blankets she had piled on him while she sat in the cold. He saw not a victim, but a woman of immense strength who, on the eve of losing everything, had not hesitated to give her last bit of comfort to a complete stranger. A quiet fury began to burn in his eyes. "No one should treat an elder this way," he said, the words a low growl. "No one." He struggled to reach into the pocket of his jacket. Eleanor moved to help him, and he pulled out a battered cell phone. The screen was cracked, but it powered on. "No service last night," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "But the tower should be back up now." He punched in a number with his thumb, his movements quick and purposeful. He held the phone to his ear, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her uneasy. After a moment, a voice answered on the other end. "Preacher," Patch said, his voice suddenly imbued with a formal respect. "It's me."
"I'm okay."
"I had a little trouble," he paused, listening. "Yeah, the storm. My leg's broken, but I'm safe. An angel found me." Another pause. He looked directly at Eleanor. "Her name is Eleanor Vance. She lives in the old house off Route 7, the one her husband Arthur built." He listened again, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, that Arthur. You need to come. And you need to bring everyone." He ended the call and looked at Eleanor. A strange, reassuring calm now settled over him. "Help is coming, Eleanor," he said. "Don't you worry about a thing." The sound began as a whisper, a low thrumming on the edge of hearing, so faint Eleanor thought it was the blood in her own ears. But it grew steadily, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated up through the soles of her feet, through the very foundations of the old house. It was a sound unlike any she had ever heard, a gathering of mechanical thunder that seemed to make the crisp winter air tremble. Neighbors, digging their way out from the snow, paused and looked down the long, white-clad road. The hum became a rumble, then a roar, a visceral, ground-shaking wave of sound that was both terrifying and magnificent. And then they appeared, over the crest of the hill, one by one, then two by two, then in a great dark flood came the motorcycles. They were not a scattered group. They moved with the disciplined precision of a cavalry charge. Sunlight glinted off an ocean of polished chrome and black leather. They filled the road from shoulder to shoulder, a phalanx of steel and horsepower. On their backs were the unmistakable colors of the Hells Angels, a symbol that struck fear and awe into the hearts of civilians. They poured onto her quiet, snow-covered street, their engines dropping to a synchronized, rumbling idle that was somehow more intimidating than the full-throated roar. They didn't park haphazardly. They formed a perfect, silent perimeter around her property. One line of bikes faced the street, a formidable wall. Others sealed off the back alley. They moved with an unnerving lack of chaos, each rider knowing his place, each movement economical and deliberate. The final count was staggering. 243 motorcycles, each carrying a rider who looked as if he were carved from granite and fury. The community was frozen in shock. Mrs. Gable stood on her porch, her shovel forgotten in a snowbank, her mouth agape. Mr. Henderson, who had avoided Eleanor's gaze for a week, now stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. This was not a random gathering. This was an occupation. Marcus Thorne, arriving in his heated luxury sedan to oversee the morning's eviction, was forced to stop a block away. He got out of his car, his face a mask of arrogant confusion, and started to stride toward the house, his phone already to his ear, likely calling the sheriff. Two of the bikers, men the size of refrigerators, silently detached from the line and moved to block his path. They didn't speak. They didn't threaten. They simply stood there, their arms crossed over their massive chests, their presence an absolute and non-negotiable barrier. Thorne stopped dead, his bluster evaporating in the face of this silent, immovable wall of leather and muscle. He began to shout, his voice thin and reedy against the percussive thrum of 243 engines. No one responded. They simply watched him, their expressions hidden behind sunglasses and beards, their collective gaze a heavy, crushing weight. Inside the house, Eleanor stood at the window, her hand to her throat, utterly bewildered. Patch on the sofa gave her a small, pain-laced smile. "I told you help was coming," he said. A path cleared through the ranks, and one man began to walk toward her front door. He was older than the rest, his beard shot through with gray, but he moved with an aura of absolute authority. This was their leader. This was Preacher. Preacher moved up the freshly shoveled walkway, a path cleared moments before by two prospects with silent efficiency, with a gravity that commanded the attention of the entire street. He was not a large man in the way his subordinates were, not a mountain of muscle, but he possessed an intensity that made him seem larger than life. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. He carried the weight of his authority not as a burden, but as a mantle he had earned through decades of trial and loyalty. He stopped on the porch, removed his sunglasses, and knocked softly on the door, a gesture of respect that seemed utterly at odds with the overwhelming force assembled behind him. Eleanor opened the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The man before her offered a slight nod, his gaze direct but not unkind. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, "I'm here to see my boy, and to see you." He looked past her to where Patch lay on the sofa, and a flicker of concern crossed his face before being replaced by a steely composure. He stepped inside, his boots making a soft sound on the wooden floor, and the house seemed to shrink around his presence. He walked over to the sofa and placed a hand on Patch's shoulder. "You gave us a scare, kid," he said, the affection in his voice unmistakable. Patch grinned weakly. "Takes more than a little snow to stop me, but I wouldn't have made it without her, Preacher. She saved me." Preacher's gaze shifted back to Eleanor, and this time it was filled with a deep, profound gratitude. "We are in your debt, Mrs. Vance. A debt my club always repays." Eleanor was still struggling to process the scene. "But how did you know my name? Or my husband's?" Preacher's expression softened. He walked over to the mantelpiece and gently picked up the photograph of Arthur in his uniform. He stared at it for a long moment, a universe of memory in his eyes. "I didn't just know Arthur," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I served under him. He was my sergeant. A long time ago, in a place very far from here." A wave of shock washed over Eleanor. She looked from the fearsome biker leader to the smiling young man in the photograph. "Arthur, he never said." "He wouldn't have," Preacher said with a sad smile. "That was his way. He wasn't one to boast. But let me tell you, Eleanor, that man was a legend. He was the most honorable man I ever knew. He pulled me out of a firefight when everyone else had written me off for dead. He saved my life, just like you saved my son's." He turned to face her fully. After the war, a few of us started writing. It was a way to find our footing back in the world, to stick together. Arthur rode with us for a while. He was one of our founding members, one of the originals. He taught us our code. Loyalty, honor, respect. We look after our own. And we never ever forget a debt. He gestured toward the window, at the army of men standing silent guard. Arthur Vance was our brother. That makes you our family. And this house is sacred ground. The truth of it settled over the room. A stunning, powerful revelation. Her act of kindness had not been random. It had been a test of character, an echo of her husband's legacy. By saving one freezing boy, she had inadvertently invoked a sacred oath, summoning the guardians her husband had helped create decades ago. The debt was not hers to patch. It was the club's to Arthur, and she was the living embodiment of that long-held, sacred honor. The standoff outside had reached a fever pitch. Marcus Thorne, his face purple with rage, was screaming into his phone at the sheriff, who was clearly reluctant to wade into a confrontation with nearly 250 notoriously formidable bikers. Thorne's frustration boiled over. He ended the call and made another, more desperate attempt to push past the two silent sentinels blocking his path. "This is my property. I have a court order," he shrieked, waving a piece of paper. One of the bikers, a man with a long, braided beard, slowly lowered his sunglasses and looked Thorne directly in the eye. He didn't say a word. The sheer, unadulterated menace in that silent gaze was enough to make Thorne stumble back a step, his bravado finally cracking. Just then, Preacher emerged from the house, Eleanor standing just behind him in the doorway. He surveyed the scene, his eyes landing on Thorne. "This property belongs to the widow of a founding member of our club," Preacher announced, his voice booming across the silent street with chilling authority. "It is under our protection now. You and your piece of paper are no longer welcome here." Thorne, emboldened by the presence of an audience, found a last reserve of arrogance. "This is a legal matter. You can't just do this. I'll have every one of you thugs arrested." Preacher smiled, a cold, thin expression devoid of any humor. "Thugs?" he repeated softly. He pulled out his own phone and made a call. "Yeah, it's me. Send him in." A moment later, a man in a crisp, expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase, detached himself from the crowd of bikers. He walked past Thorne without a glance and handed the briefcase to Preacher. Preacher opened it and produced a thick file. "This isn't just a legal matter," Preacher said, his voice like grinding stones. "It's a moral one. You see, we have lawyers too. Good ones. And they've been looking into Thorne development. They found a pattern of predatory lending targeting seniors. They found forged signatures, illegal fees, racketeering. It turns out Mrs. Vance's debt isn't just invalid. It's criminal." He tossed the file onto the snow at Thorne's feet. "You're not just going to lose this house, Mr. Thorne. You're going to lose everything. And you're going to spend a very long time in a very small room, thinking about what you've done." The color drained from Thorne's face. He stared at the file, then at the unyielding faces of the bikers surrounding him, and finally at the calm, resolute face of the old woman he had tried to break. He was beaten, utterly and completely. As Thorne stood there, paralyzed by the ruin of his own making, the bikers began to move. But it wasn't with violence. It was with purpose. A truck pulled up, loaded with lumber and tools. Another arrived, filled with groceries. Men who looked like they could tear down a building with their bare hands began to work with a gentle, focused energy. They swarmed the small house, their movements a whirlwind of constructive activity. Shingles were replaced on the roof. The broken fence was torn down and a new one started. The hideous red spray paint was sanded away, and a fresh coat of white paint was applied. The community, watching from their windows, finally began to stir. Shamed by their own inaction and inspired by this incredible display of loyalty, they emerged from their homes. Mrs. Gable appeared with a large, steaming pot of coffee. Mr. Henderson rolled his own toolbox down the street. Soon, a small army of neighbors was working alongside the formidable bikers, offering food, help, and long overdue apologies. Preacher walked over to Eleanor, who was watching the scene with tears in her eyes. He held out a brand new leather vest. It was small, her size. On the back, it bore the Full Hell's Angels insignia. On the front, over the heart, was a single custom-stitched patch. It read, First Lady. In memory of Arthur, it was the highest honor they could bestow, a symbol of ultimate respect and belonging. She was one of them now. She was family. The days that followed were a quiet revolution on a small, forgotten street. The roar of the motorcycles was replaced by the productive sounds of hammers, saws, and quiet conversation. The house was not just repaired. It was reborn. The roof was made sound, the porch railings were replaced, and the entire exterior was given a fresh coat of pale yellow paint, the color Eleanor had always wanted but could never afford. Inside, a club member who was a master electrician rewired the entire house, ensuring her safety. Another, a plumber, installed a new water heater. They filled her pantry, stocked her freezer, and chopped enough firewood to last her 3 winters. They worked with a reverence that was both touching and profound, treating every nail and board as if they were restoring a sacred cathedral. The bikers themselves became a fixture. They did not leave. A rotating guard of 2 men remained on the street 24 hours a day. Their bikes were parked discreetly at the curb, a silent, gleaming promise of protection. They were polite, quiet, and watchful. At first, the neighborhood was wary, but soon the bikers' presence became a comfort. They helped neighbors carry in groceries. They walked children home from the bus stop. They became the silent, leather-clad guardians of the entire block. Marcus Thorne was never seen again. News trickled through the town that his offices had been raided by federal agents. His empire, built on the exploitation of the vulnerable, crumbled to dust. The foreclosure notice, and the debt it represented, vanished as if it had never existed. The true transformation, however, was in Eleanor. The weight of fear and despair had lifted from her shoulders. A light returned to her eyes. She moved with a renewed purpose, baking cookies for the men on duty, sharing stories of Arthur with Preacher, who visited her every afternoon. She was no longer the frail, forgotten widow. She was a matriarch. She was the First Lady. The climax of this transformation came one crisp Saturday afternoon. The work on the house was complete. The entire chapter, all 243 members, returned. They didn't roar into the street this time. They came in quietly, parking their bikes in neat rows and gathering on her new lawn. Preacher, acting as spokesman, stood before her on the porch. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This house was built on honor. We just gave it a new coat of paint." He gestured to the assembled men. A sea of hard faces softened by genuine respect. "This is your family now. You will never be alone again. You will never be cold again. You will never be afraid again. This is our promise." This is Arthur's legacy. Eleanor, wearing her new vest over her simple cardigan, looked out at the faces of these men. These fierce, loyal, honorable men, and she saw the spirit of her husband reflected in every single one of them. She didn't make a grand speech. She simply smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Welcome home." It was a quiet moment, but it was the most powerful recognition of all. Her quiet dignity had not only saved her home, it had built a new one, forged in loyalty and cemented in the unlikeliest of brotherhoods. The final image of that day was not one of intimidation, but of belonging. Eleanor Vance, sitting in her rocking chair on her newly painted porch, flanked by 2 of the club's most senior members, sipping tea. The chrome of their bikes gleamed like the shields of ancient knights, and the quiet rumble of their presence was the new heartbeat of the neighborhood, a constant, reassuring rhythm of respect secured and dignity restored.